Hey, this is Pastor Bunjee Garrett, and I want to take some time today to present you with another word of encouragement. Well, it's the 8th day of Black History Month, and so I wanted to take this opportunity to consider the most recent Gallup poll. And this poll helps us to see that Black voters are currently deserting the Democrat Party in numbers that could potentially affect President Biden's second term. As a matter of fact, this Gallup survey, it helps us to see that when it comes to Black Americans, the Democrat lead over Republicans has dropped by almost 20% over the past 3 years. Now, I wonder what's happened over the past 3 years to cause this political shift here in America. Oh, yeah, Joe Biden happened. That's what happened. And let's not forget that it was actually back in 1977 when then Senator Joe Biden, he actually fought against the federal funding of busing. And it was during a Senate Judiciary hearing when Senator Biden shared one of his greatest concerns about, federal busing by declaring this, and I quote him here. He said, "Unless we do something about this, my children are going to grow up in a jungle. The jungle being a racial jungle with tensions having built so high that it is going to explode at some point." That's right, Senator Biden was trying to stop the federal funding of busing in Delaware because, according to him, he didn't want his kids growing up in a racial jungle. And listen, before you accuse me of taking this quote out of its context, I've read the context, and he still said what he said. And I also encourage you to remember the way that Kamala Harris challenged Biden about this very thing. It was during the Democrat primary debates, and she did this by asking Joe this, and I quote her, "Do you agree today that you were wrong to oppose busing in America then? Do you agree?" Well, in response, Biden declared, "I did not oppose busing in America. What I opposed is busing ordered by the Department of Education." Okay, so technically, President Biden is correct in saying that he was really only opposing busing at the federal level. And listen, I can understand his point, and I'm all for senators protecting the rights of every state, like like Texas, say. I think that states should be able to make decisions for their state without federal oversight. And yet, it's still abundantly clear that he was a senator there in Delaware who was fighting for the right to stop the federal government from coming into Delaware and enforcing busing there in the state of Delaware. Now, valid arguments can be made both for and against busing as a means for desegregation, and yet we must not fail to forget Biden is on record presenting his greatest concern, which was that busing would end up forcing his kids to grow up in a racial jungle, with tensions having built so high that it would just explode at some point in time. Now, in order to understand his concern, we should take a moment to consider the problem that busing was supposed to solve. With this as the focus, we ought to look back to Democrat President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR for short, and we have to consider FDR's New Deal. Now, according to Jim Powell, FDR's New Deal, it harmed many Black Americans, and in several different ways. Here's how he explains it, and I quote, "The flagship of the New Deal was the National Industrial Recovery Act passed in June 1933. It authorized the president to issue executive orders establishing some 700 industrial cartels which restricted output and forced wages and prices above market levels." And then he goes on to explain this. He says the minimum wage regulations made it illegal for employers to hire people who weren't worth the minimum because they lacked skills. As a result, he says, some 500,000 Blacks, particularly in the South, were estimated to have lost their jobs. Simply put, the New Deal, it was a bad deal for Black Americans. Powell went on to point out how the New Deal's Agricultural Adjustment Act also resulted in less work for thousands of Black sharecroppers, while simultaneously raising the price of food, which then affected the same people who just lost their jobs. FDR's New Deal was a bad deal for Black Americans. FDR's New Deal also included the Wagner Act of 1935, which harmed Black Americans by making labor union monopolies legal. Powell explains it in this way, and I quote, "By giving labor unions the monopoly power to exclusively represent employees in a workplace, the Wagner Act had the effect of excluding Blacks since the dominant unions discriminated against Blacks." That's right, the Wagner Act, It was initially drafted with a provision prohibiting racial discrimination, but then the American Federation of Labor successfully lobbied against that, and as a result of that win, the AFL unions used their new power to exclude blacks on large scale. So yeah, FDR's New Deal, it was a bad deal for Black Americans. The New Deal also resulted in the Tennessee Valley Authority, which flooded an estimated 730,000 acres of land behind its dams, and as a result, more than 15,000 people were forced from their homes, and the farmers in this area, well, the landowners received cash settlements for their farms which became condemned property. But the tenant farmers who didn't own land, most of whom were black, they got nothing out of this. So yeah, FDR's New Deal was a bad deal for Black Americans. Powell also pointed out that New Deal spending programs were channeled away from the poorest people in America, and this included millions of Black Americans who lived in the South. The bulk of New Deal spending went to the states where FDR's previous election returns were relatively close. And so rather than helping people who had the greatest need in America, FDR seems to have used his position as president to secure re-election through this refocused direction of federal funds. The Democrat county chairman, V.G. Copeland, he confirmed this when he told FDR's campaign manager, James Farley, that they were going to use these Democratic projects to make votes for the Democratic Party. For example, FDR's New Deal included the Public Works Administration, which used federal money to go and build segregated public housing in urban neighborhoods, which were relatively close to the factories where these residents were encouraged to go and work. And listen, these are the same neighborhoods that kids needed to be bussed out of during the 70s. That's right, FDR's New Deal policies effectively created the first ghettos here in our country. And it's for this reason that Jim Powell concludes his article in this way, and I quote him here: "If FDR's New Deal policies weren't conceived with racist intent, they certainly had racist consequences." Now, I think that's a fair assessment, and yet I would take it a step further by reminding you that FDR's Democratic Party is the same party that fought against the Civil War amendments. Remember, President Roosevelt's Democratic Party, they were unified in their opposition to the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. They were opposed to the 14th Amendment, which gave blacks citizenship, and they were opposed to the 15th Amendment, which gave blacks the right to vote. That's right. The Democrat Party under President Andrew Johnson not only opposed reparations, but they also fought against the Civil War amendments, which established the freedom and the citizenship and the right to vote for every black slave here in America. And in contrast to this, the Republican Party was established by American abolitionists who not only fought the Civil War in order to end slavery here in the States, but they also created and passed the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments because they truly believed that every person has been created equal by our Creator. Now, with that being the case, you shouldn't be surprised to learn that the first black political leaders here in our country, they were all Republicans. And listen, the majority of black voters supported the Republican Party, that is, until the 1930s, when Black Americans were enticed by FDR's New Deal, and this despite the fact that Roosevelt had actively assisted President Woodrow Wilson's goal to reintroduce segregation back into our military. Not only that, but up until that point in time, Democrats had made it perfectly clear that Black Americans were unwelcome in the Democratic Party. And it was well known that Roosevelt was fairly conventional in his racial attitudes, which is a nice way of saying Roosevelt was a racist. And yet over the course of his first term as president, the newly established Gallup poll revealed that FDR ended up receiving 76% of the black vote. And there should be no doubt that this shift was due to the fact that FDR's New Deal policies presented impoverished people here in America with the financial incentives to vote for FDR. Sadly, those who embraced this New Deal ultimately were making a deal with the devil, resulting in a welfare class that was created by systemic racism. With that being the case, it's crucial for Black Americans to realize that the policies of the Democratic Party appear to be designed to keep people trapped in a welfare system, which creates the conditions by which the same people are then forced to continue voting for the same party. And it's sad to say that they've done an excellent job with the historic revision that has led many to believe that it's the Republican Party that's filled with all the racist bigots who are, trying to put black Americans back in chains. Here's how Vice President Joe Biden put it back in 2012 when he assured his predominantly black audience that the Republican Party has a plan to, and I quote him here, they're going to put you all back in chains. Now that's shocking and offensive, and especially as we remember that it was the Democratic Party that fought to protect slavery here in the States. And it was the Democratic Party that fought against the 13th and the 14th and the 15th Amendments. It was the Democratic Party that enacted all of the Jim Crow laws. And it was the Democratic Party that gave America the New Deal, which effectively created the ghettos that we find all across our country. Now listen, I'm not here to tell you who to vote for, and yet I can't help but to be leery of a left-leaning party that's willing to use people like pawns while simultaneously creating the conditions for more and more government control over the same people. Listen, if you're tired of systemic racism in our government, then it's time to stop voting for the racists. It's time to stop voting for those who have implemented these policies all in the name of democracy. And at the same time, it's also important for us to remember that the Lord is the one who has given every person our unalienable rights. And that's true regardless of our race. The Lord has given all people, everyone created, in his image. We've all been given the unalienable rights of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. That being the case, we do well to vote for the leaders who realize that it's really just their job to protect our rights, which have been given to us by God. And as we vote for these leaders who will protect our rights given to us by God, well, this is one way that we can fight the good fight of faith, and all for the glory of God.